Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Ryan O'Neill.
He's getting ready to go. It's Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower in the studio with us this morning. Thank you for coming in, Dr. Ostrower.
Pleasure to be here on what may be a nice day.
Yeah, they say it's going to get nice and sunny today. Dr. Ostrower, I've got a lot of things on this day in history, but I'm guessing you want to talk about, how do I say it, the comeback of John Dean?
Well, yeah, John Dean is back is right. John Dean was the president, that is to say, President Nixon's counsel in the White House. Now remember, a White House counsel is not technically the president's lawyer. He is the White House lawyer, in other words, kind of institutionally. But it was John Dean who, among other things, was recorded as saying on the tapes from the back then in the Watergate scandal back in the 1970s, that there is a cancer growing on the presidency. It was John Dean who was put in charge back in those days of coordinating a cover-up, paying off certain people who knew what was going on and whatnot. And here he is again. Republicans have been saying that, well, there's no reason that we should be revisiting Watergate. It's irrelevant. The Democrats are saying, of course, that there are parallels between what happened in the 1970s and what's happening today. And so they brought John Dean in because the president is not going to testify, because Attorney General William Barr has refused to testify, and consequently, I guess they're going to the B team, that is to say, John Dean. But I want to make one comment about what Dean, well, really two comments about what Dean said. The essence of his testimony is that, yeah, there really is a parallel between the way in which President Nixon obstructed justice in 1972 and 1973 and 1974, and the way in which Donald Trump is obstructing justice today. He said, in other words, that the parallels are striking, that there is a direct connection between these things. But the other point I want to make about John Dean is that I'm a historian. Okay, Gary Ostrower is a historian. And we historians tend to say that if you don't learn from the past, you're going to make the same mistakes again and again and again. Or to put it in a slightly different way, as I tell my students every single year at Alfred University, we are products of our past. We better understand our history. I care what little hair I have left out, because schools, high schools, but also colleges are reducing the requirements in terms of the study of history. I think that we have a lot to learn from John Dean, and I'm afraid that too many people are simply ignoring what he had to say.
On the topic of high school and college history, what are your thoughts there?
Well, the California State university system, and when I say the state university system, there are two state systems in California on higher education. One is for the big universities, that would be places like Davis and UCLA and Santa Barbara and Berkeley. That's one university system. And then they have a state university system, which includes schools like Northridge and Chico and whatnot. It's not quite the same thing, okay? They're separate organizations. In that second group of state institutions, California has essentially eliminated a requirement for students to study history. And, again, I mean, obviously I'm kind of biased in talking about all of this, but I think that that's madness. We know today, and I think I may have mentioned this on this program once before, that there are 43% of Americans, this is not just high school students, not college students, 43% of Americans do not know which countries the United States fought against during World War II. Many people think, 43% of the public thinks either they don't know at all or we were fighting against the Soviet Union while allied with Nazi Germany. Now, that kind of ignorance drives people like me crazy. I'll give you another example of what I mean by this. 20% of all Americans can identify the, quote, Emancipation Proclamation. Brian, you know, and certainly I know, that it represented in 1863, Lincoln's executive order to free the slaves. And, of course, he didn't really free all the slaves because many of the slaves were still in, they were held in bondage in areas that were controlled by the Confederacy. But where the Union Army did control territory, those slaves were freed. And I can give you many other examples, not the least of which is that 25% of all Americans do not know in which century Columbus discovered America. Okay? Well, it was the 15th century, folks, just in case you're a little unsure about that, in 1492. But, these are pretty basic things. These are factual things. And above and beyond that factual stuff, there's a lot of material, there's a lot of information out there which helps us understand the way in which our values have been, have evolved, the way in which our Constitution works, the reason why we have the kind of Constitution that we do. And to the extent that we're losing a sense of that, or we're losing an understanding of all that, I think, frankly, that we're in trouble. And I think that trouble is exhibited by the degree to which 40% of the public thinks that Donald Trump is not a threat to American values right now. I'm talking about political values, the values that we usually, that we define as the values of a democratic society.
Now, Dr. Ostrower, when I was coming up, I heard criticisms of social studies versus history and the lack of geography. Is this something that's been going on a long time?
Yeah, it's been going on for about 40 years now. To give you an example, and again, I don't want to simply argue that, the good old days is what we were doing.
Yeah.
Okay. But when I was in school, that is to say in elementary school and in high school, I had to take a course in geography, simply called geography. I took one in 8th grade. I took that course in, I believe it was 6th grade, I think it was. I don't remember exactly. I think it was 6th grade, maybe 5th grade. And I also took it in high school. Like 4 different times, I took a course in geography. Today, geography has been kind of subsumed into something called social studies, which includes not only a little bit of geography, which really means that students don't know very much at all about geography, but also economics, but also civics, but also history. In other words, social studies becomes kind of a mush of a whole bunch of these different things. And so, students aren't getting very much of any single one of them. And again, I think it, says something about our ignorance. And since we're talking about geography, let me make a comment about that, because I think it relates to, what's happening. In 1960, the United States became involved in a war in Vietnam. Well, why did we become involved in a war in Vietnam? The answer is complex. It has to do with things that were going on before World War II. It has to do with the collapse of French colonial rule in Vietnam. It has to do with a whole bunch of other things. But the fact of the matter is that probably not more than 1 or 2% of the American public knew where Vietnam was. And if they knew something about the geography of Vietnam, they have some sense as to whether or not fighting a war there was in the national interest. But we didn't know. Most Americans knew nothing about Vietnam. And I think our ignorance becomes one of the many, many factors that led us into a disastrous foreign policy experience between 1960 and 1975.
As long as we're talking educational trends, what do you make of the whole Common Core thing?
Well, I happen to be I support the Common Core, although I think that there are many people out there who don't support it. But I also understand that there are some legitimate criticisms of Common Core. Okay, so that if you're going to deal with Common Core, the criticisms really boil down to 2 things. There are many, many conservatives who don't like it because they feel that it's imposing a national standard on what should be, education as defined locally. In other words, it, to a certain extent, undermines the federal quality of American education. I don't have too much sympathy for that. And the reason is that in many, many states, based on what we're talking about already, having to do with social studies and so forth, the educational standards in the United States have really been weakened, have really been, I think, pretty pathetic. And as a matter of fact, if we utilize some of the standard, examinations, American students in fields like writing, in fields like mathematics and fields like science do not measure up, simply don't measure up to what students are doing in many, many other industrialized countries. In other words, we're going to have to deal with, if you will, some of the failures of American education. There's another criticism of Common Core, and that is that there is too much testing. And I think that there's a lot to that. In other words, to the extent that teachers are going to teach for the test rather than for a more generalized kind of understanding of what all of this material means, I think that but I think that can be improved. In other words, I think that, look, we better understand that American education at the elementary school level and at the secondary school level is less good than it used to be. There may be other reasons for this, but I think the Common Core is at least a reasonable effort to address the need to improve what we are doing at the elementary and secondary school levels.
Talking with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower, back in 60 seconds.
Do you want to make your home buying experience smart, simple, and convenient? At Steuben Trust Company, our dedicated team will answer your questions and guide you through the entire process. Our goal is to find the right mortgage solution for you and your family, and to make owning your dream home reality. So stop into any one of our convenient locations or visit SteubenTrust.com to learn more. Steuben Trust Company, member FDIC, an equal housing lender.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carroll, who says it's going to get sunny today.
Sunshine today. We're going to be breezy with highs reaching 70 degrees later this afternoon. It's going to be clear and unusually cool for tonight. You need an extra blanket on the bed if you're going to be sleeping with the windows open. Lows will be 45 to 50. Partial sun tomorrow, 75 to 80. Showers arrive late tomorrow night. Lows 55 to 60. Rain at times on Thursday. Highs Thursday, 65 to 70 degrees.
Thanks, Rob. Well, we're back with Dr. Gary Ostrower, who marked, 50 years of teaching at AU this week?
I've got I was recognized for 50 years of teaching at AU is right. It was a really nice ceremony. It was part of Alfred University's annual reunion. And on Saturday, the president of the university, President Mark Zupan, conferred upon me what we call the Order of Merit. So I was rather flattered by all of that, but 50 years is a long time, and it gave me a chance, of course, to reflect on what it meant to be teaching back in 1969 when I started. Even a little bit earlier, I began my teaching career at Vassar College in 1967. So, I've been doing it for a long time. The days go by awfully quickly, in the wink of an eye.
Dr. Ostrower, if we could talk this day in history a little bit, JFK faced down Governor George Wallace on this day in 1963.
Well, hey, before I say something about President Kennedy and George Wallace, and that's a good point to make, I think, I want to make, if I may, one other comment about, having taught for 50 years, because I think it's relevant to what we're saying right now. When I began teaching at Alfred University in 1969, students were required to take at least 8 credits, 2 full courses in the field of history, and that was true at most American colleges. There were many, many more requirements for the study of history than there are today. Today at Alfred University, many students are required to take only 1 course, and some students are not required to take any courses in the field of history. And it goes back to what we were saying about social studies and the lack of historical knowledge on the part of this generation generally. In the 1950s, during the 1950s, when I went to college, history majors were the most popular major subject in American universities. Today, history is way down the list. It's about maybe 10th out of around 20 different possible majors that students could take.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it has something to do with the degree to which we no longer believe that history is really important. I think to a certain extent it may be that people in other fields want more study of those areas, and therefore, students are going to study history less. But I can tell you this. that fairly recently, between 2005 and 2019, that's only 15 years, the number of history majors has dropped by 30 to 40% in American colleges and universities. Now, that's not true in all 4,000 American colleges and universities, but it's certainly true in most. It certainly is true in Alfred University. In other words, what's happening at Alfred is fairly typical of what's happening elsewhere. At St. Bonaventure, where I am the ombudsman, likewise, there's a sharp drop in the number of students who are studying history. And I think that it has to do with something else, and it has to do with the degree to which, especially in light of, recent economic developments, there is a fear on the part of parents that their kids will not get jobs unless they major in the so-called STEM fields. The STEM fields means science and technology, it means mathematics, okay, and engineering, okay, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Well, okay, if you're going to study those things, that's great, but it does mean that in all likelihood you're going to wind up placing less of an emphasis on things like history and English and philosophy. I think humanities are in trouble, and history is one of those humanities subjects.
Now on to George Wallace, if we could.
George Wallace was the governor of Alabama back during the 1960s. And it was during the 1960s that the civil rights program in the United States generally had really kicked up. Wallace said in 1963, I think it was 63, it could have been 62, but I believe it was 63, that he would not permit, it was in 63, that he would not permit the integration, that is to say the racial integration of Alabama public schools, nor would he permit the integration of the University of Alabama. And so he stood in the door of the University Administration building to say, segregation now, segregation forever. Well, the United States government required, and at the use of federal force, that the university integrate. The same thing happened a little bit earlier. We shouldn't forget about this. At the University of Mississippi in October of 1962, the governor of that state, his name was Ross Barnett, had made an agreement with President Kennedy at that time to integrate the university, and then he backed away from the agreement. He backed away from the agreement for two reasons. Number one, because he was himself a segregationist, and number two, because he feared that he would be subject to a great deal of criticism, including the loss of his position by the segregationist white sentiment in Mississippi. And as a result of that, President Kennedy ordered into Mississippi, into Oxford, Mississippi, where the university was located, the 101st Airborne, hundreds upon hundreds of FBI agents, about 3,000 or 4,000 federal marshals, and he nationalized the Mississippi National Guard. And yet, in spite of all of this, and there was a good deal of violence in Oxford, Mississippi as a result of all of that, but eventually the university was integrated. James Meredith, some of you may remember that name. James Meredith became the first black student at, in this case, the University of Mississippi Law School. George Wallace did the same thing more or less the following year. But Wallace became a symbol, more than Barnett. He became a symbol of opposition to integration. And he used that symbolism to run for president in 1968, to run for president in 1972. In other words, he became a real national political figure. In 1972, unfortunately, he was subject to an assassination attempt. He wasn't killed, but he was badly wounded, and it effectively ended his, how shall I put it, his national political career.
You know what I find interesting about the aftermath of the assassination attempt on George Wallace? I think this comes out of the Nixon tapes. Nixon wanted E. Howard Hunt, who I'm not sure technically was a Watergate burglar, but tied to the Watergate burglars. The Watergate burglars had his number and address on their wallet. Nixon wanted to he wanted E. Howard Hunt to break into the suspect's home and plant McGovern literature. Yeah, well, look,
Howard Hunt was involved in what they call dirty tricks. But that dirty tricks wasn't simply tricks. It wasn't simply a matter of practical jokes. These were things that were fundamentally undermining the American democratic political system. Hunt was the fellow, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that he had a CIA background, but Hunt was the fellow who authorized the break-in in 1972 into the Democratic National Committee. So when you say that the burglars had his number in their phone books, in the memos, you bet they did. I mean, Hunt was deeply involved in this. This was part of a cover-up, and it became then not only part of a cover-up, but part of what Nixon sought to do in terms of obstructing justice, of undermining the investigation. And that's where John Dean comes in. So we began this program today with John Dean, and maybe we should go back to John Dean. What John Dean was essentially saying was that the President of the United States was fundamentally seeking to obstruct justice. And that's essentially what the Mueller report has said about President Trump today in respect to Russian involvement in the American election during 2016. And I ask people, look, I understand that the Mueller report is 448 pages. I know that most people are not going to read it. But read the second portion of that report. Read at least a few pages, 16 pages, that deal with the subject of obstruction of justice. You cannot read that report and then believe President Trump when he says the report exonerated him, that the report found no wrongdoing. The report found a great deal of wrongdoing, and you can read it for yourself. Don't take my word for it.
There were other this day in histories. I don't think we have time to get to them today, Dr. Ostrower. Finishing up with your 50 years at AU, though, that's very interesting. What will you remember the most about Alfred University?
Well, look, I remember a lot of things back in those early days when students had to wear beanies and women had curfews. All of those things are gone today. Of course, by the time I came back to teach at Alfred University in 1969, it was right in the middle of the Vietnam War. There was a lot more political agitation at the universities than there are today. But I also want to make one general observation, and that is that students back in that period read much more than they do today. And again, what I'm saying is not only true of Alfred University, it's true in probably every university in the United States of America. And because they read much more, they wrote a lot better than they do today. I think it's one of the key developments that we have in American education.
Dr. Ostrower, as always, thank you so much for coming in.
Hey, thank you very much for having me over here.